Trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us as a result of what happened to us. Gabor Maté. Imagine carrying an invisible wound throughout your entire existence, a pain without a name, yet powerful enough to shape your decisions, your relationships, and your emotional responses. But what if this pain wasn't a flaw, but rather an adaptation? What if the anxiety, addiction, anger, or lack of focus you experience is, in truth, a silent plea for help? We exist within a culture quick to judge behaviors without ever questioning their origins. Doctors treat symptoms, society assigns labels, the justice system punishes. Yet few dare to ask, what is the source of this suffering? In this video, we will dive deep into the insights of renowned physician Gabor Maté, who dedicated decades to listening to the stories hidden behind emotional scars. His revelations are both unsettling and liberating. Most adult emotional pain has its roots buried in the quiet corners of childhood. Get ready to face truths long left unspoken. This isn't just a video about trauma, it is a reflection, a gateway to realizing that behind every seemingly irrational action lies a pattern, a need, an emotional memory. Now take a deep breath. Let's begin this journey to understand that healing begins the moment we stop judging and start listening. Gabor Maté's revolutionary perspective. To grasp what truly lies beneath human suffering, one must learn to listen beyond mere words. That's precisely what Gabor Maté did during his 12 years working with individuals battling addiction on the streets of Canada. Where most saw addicts, he saw life stories. Where others detected weakness, he identified deep-rooted pain. Rather than label them, he asked, "What happened to you?" This way of seeing led him to challenge the conventional doctrines of modern medicine. In his view, addiction isn't a moral collapse or a calculated decision, nor is it a defect of character or an unchangeable genetic curse. Instead, it is a coping mechanism, a means to survive overwhelming emotional pain. In Western medicine, addiction is often treated as a brain disease, something encoded in our DNA, to be managed with drugs or strict abstinence techniques. But Gabor Maté strongly refutes this framework. For him, addiction is a natural response to unbearable pain, a momentary relief in the absence of empathy or emotional support. And his stance is not built on opinion alone. Studies in neuroscience, psychology, and child development all align with his conclusions. There is a clear correlation between early life adversity and the emergence of compulsive behaviors in adulthood. Maté stresses that we must shift our focus away from the destructive act and toward the inner suffering that birthed it. Addiction, he argues, is not the root issue. It is an unconscious attempt at self-healing. The question isn't why the addiction, but why the pain. Gabor Maté. This shift in viewpoint not only redefines how we see those struggling with dependency, but also invites a radically different path to healing, one that begins with compassion, presence, and deep understanding. Trauma, biology, and development. If emotional pain is the underlying force behind addiction, then we must explore how that pain originates. This investigation takes us straight into childhood, the foundational period where our emotional and neurological roots are laid down. Gabor Maté emphasizes that our early life experiences influence not only who we become, but also shape the very wiring of our brain. In the first years of life, the human brain is under intense development. Millions of neural connections form every second, driven by the emotional experiences of the child. When the environment is nurturing, loving, and stable, the brain follows a path of healthy development. But when surrounded by emotional volatility, neglect, or stress, the brain shifts into survival mode, learning to protect rather than to trust. According to Maté, biology and emotion are not two separate realms. They are intimately bound. Emotions like fear, rejection, and abandonment have direct effects on the immune system, hormonal balance, and the development of neural circuits. In other words, emotional pain isn't just felt, it's physically embedded into the body. Children exposed to stress they can neither escape nor fight often develop dissociation as a coping tool. It's as if they disconnect from their own being to endure what they cannot mentally process. Over time, this becomes a lasting trait, a persistent detachment from body, feelings, and present reality. Emotions and biology are deeply interconnected. Gabor Maté. This understanding challenges the belief that we are simply at the mercy of our genetic blueprint. While genes may create the framework, it is life experience, particularly emotional experience, that determines whether that potential is awakened or remains dormant. Carl Jung had already gestured toward this truth decades before Maté. Whatever is not made conscious will return as fate. The Carl Jung. What isn't embraced or held in childhood often returns in adulthood as unexplained symptoms, compulsive behaviors, and emotional struggles that seem to arise from nowhere. But there is always a cause, though sometimes it is hidden in the body, stored in implicit memory, buried in a story never voiced. Trauma begins in the cradle. Among the many stories Gabor Maté has encountered, the one that left the deepest mark was his own. When he was just a year old, his mother, desperate to protect him during the Nazi occupation of Hungary, handed him over to a stranger in the street. Uncertain whether she'd survive the next day, she made a choice no parent should have to make. Maté spent an entire month apart from his mother, a period he has no verbal memory of, but one his body has never forgotten. His hippocampus, the brain region that encodes explicit memories, had not yet developed, but implicit emotional memory was already active and recording everything. The sensation of being unwanted, of abandonment, was imprinted in his being as an unspoken truth. That emotional imprint stayed with him through adulthood, long before he understood its origin. Years later, as a practicing physician, Maté began to recognize the signs: a relentless need to be needed, intense emotional pain in response to minor rejection, a never-ending hunger for validation, all of it rooted in that early separation, that desperate, unheard cry. And as he often states, these wounds are not merely psychological. They literally shape the brain and define the lens through which we see the world. The infant brain is molded by emotions that it cannot name but feels with devastating intensity. Gabor Maté. This sentence captures a forgotten truth. Babies do not grasp language, but they are deeply attuned to emotional energy. They feel their mother's fear. They sense their father's absence. They absorb the emotional climate of their environment. And those feelings become structure, shaping their neural wiring, stress responses, and ability to trust or defend themselves. The tragedy is that many adults carry this pain through life without ever understanding its source. They live trying to fill a void they cannot name, and the more they attempt to escape the pain, the deeper they sink into self-destructive cycles. Trauma doesn't always begin with violence or loud outbursts. It often starts in silence, in absence, in the lack of a gentle touch, in the gaze that never came. And this is where Gabor Maté urges us to focus our attention, not on what happened externally, but on what occurred within us because of it. The pain of parents becomes the burden of their children. Gabor Maté didn't only study trauma, he lived it. What shocked him most was realizing that even though he raised his children in a stable, peaceful environment, free from war or overt abuse, they still began to display the same symptoms he had battled himself: restlessness, distraction, anxiety. 2 of his sons were diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This challenged his assumptions about inheritance. Was it purely genetic, or was something deeper being passed down? That's when Maté uncovered a profound truth. Trauma doesn't need to be deliberate to be real. Despite his efforts as a father, he came to see that he had been emotionally absent. Immersed in his career, constantly available for his patients, he was unknowingly replicating a subconscious pattern, striving to prove his worth, trying to fill the inner emptiness left by not feeling wanted as a child. Unaware of this dynamic, His children felt the absence as emotional rejection. They internalized the idea that they didn't matter enough. Maté's unresolved pain had been transmitted to them, not through words, but through behavior, through the emotional absence, through the silence of a parent who is physically there but emotionally distant. Trauma often shows up in what we fail to give, not just in what we do. Our children don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be present. Gabor Maté's society frequently turns a blind eye to this invisible pain. Children's behaviors are labeled as defiance, inattention, or tantrums, but rarely do we ask what lies beneath. The truth is, many children are simply responding to their emotional environment. They can't explain it logically, but they feel it intensely. They absorb the mother's anxiety, the father's anger, the hollowness of a quiet home. This cycle repeats itself generation after generation. Wounded parents, even unintentionally, raise wounded children. Emotional absence, the lack of genuine listening, the subtle feeling of helplessness, all of it becomes fertile ground for trauma to grow. When Gabor Maté reflected on his past with honesty, he understood that healing wasn't just a personal endeavor. It was ancestral. It was a call to awareness, because healing oneself also means stopping the pain from echoing forward. And the first step in that healing is acknowledging that what remains unresolved in us will be lived out by our children. Authenticity versus attachment. From the very beginning of life, every human being carries two essential needs: the need for attachment and the need for authenticity. Attachment is our emotional bond with others. It is vital for a baby's survival. Authenticity, on the other hand, is our connection to our inner self, the ability to recognize what we feel, set boundaries, and act in alignment with that truth. For an infant, attachment is non-negotiable. Without it, life itself is at risk. Therefore, when there is a clash between staying true to oneself and maintaining emotional closeness with caregivers, the child instinctively makes a silent decision. Authenticity is sacrificed in order to protect attachment. This is not a conscious choice. It is a survival mechanism. Picture a child expressing anger, fear, or sadness and being punished, dismissed, or criticized for it. The child doesn't just learn that the feeling is wrong, they absorb the belief that they are wrong for having it. To avoid losing their parents' love, they suppress their emotions. Eventually, this repression becomes automatic. What once was a coping strategy becomes the child's identity. The greatest tragedy of childhood is not abuse. It's the abandonment of who we are in order to be accepted. Gabor Maté. The inner disconnection born in this process creates a profound emptiness that many try to fill throughout their lives. But this emptiness doesn't come from external lack. It comes from the loss of self, from emotions silenced too early, from the fear of being unloved if we show who we truly are. Trauma is the abandonment of self to maintain connection with others. Gabor Maté. This disconnection may feel necessary in childhood, but in adulthood, it comes at a steep cost. Anxiety, depression, addiction, and dysfunctional relationships, all stemming from a lingering unanswered question: who am I really if I had to hide parts of myself to be loved? And here, the healing journey demands bravery. Bravery to turn inward and reclaim the pieces of ourselves that we were once forced to leave behind. Addiction. As an attempt to find relief, over the years, Gabor Maté developed a new lens through which to view addiction. In his eyes, addiction is not the enemy. It is a symptom. It's a temporary coping mechanism that someone adopts when no other means of enduring their pain is available. The real issue is never the substance itself. The core of the problem lies in the pain that was never acknowledged, in the absence of emotional support, in a loneliness that often stretches back to childhood. When a person turns to drugs, alcohol, compulsive work, food, sex, or even social media in a self-destructive way, their goal isn't pleasure. What they seek is relief, a break from emotions they don't know how to articulate, from a distress that has no language, from wounds that have never been tended to. That's why Maté emphasizes that we're asking the wrong question. Instead of why this behavior, we should be asking, what pain is this person trying to ease? In doing so, he exposes an uncomfortable but powerful truth. Every form of dependency hides a genuine, though momentary, effort to feel whole. Addiction isn't the problem, it's an attempt to solve a much deeper problem. Gabor Maté. This perspective changes everything. It shifts the focus from moral judgment to human suffering. It dismantles the narrative that people struggling with addiction are weak, careless, or morally flawed. Instead, it reveals them as individuals doing their best to survive with the tools they have. Maté goes even further. He asserts that addiction is a universal human experience. Even if substances aren't involved, many of us exhibit addictive tendencies, excessive phone use, an insatiable need for validation, compulsive spending, the desire to control everything. Whenever we use something to numb our emotions, we're engaging in addiction. Therefore, the path to healing does not lie in suppressing the behavior, but in listening to its message. Addiction speaks, it screams, but few are truly listening, and perhaps it's time we start. The lie of genetics. For decades, the medical community viewed disorders such as ADHD, depression, and addiction as the unavoidable result of genetic inheritance. This belief, still widespread, promotes the idea that certain behaviors are hardwired into our DNA and handed down from parent to child like a biological sentence. But Gabor Maté began to question this oversimplified narrative. When he was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 53, and later saw two of his children receive the same diagnosis, the logical assumption was heredity. Yet, as he dug deeper into both scientific research and his personal history, he uncovered a more subtle and far more profound explanation. Maté started to understand that what was being passed down wasn't DNA alone, but emotion. His children were raised in a physically safe home, but one where their father was emotionally absent, consumed by a career that served as a buffer for his own childhood pain. The restlessness, lack of focus, and emotional emptiness his children experienced didn't stem solely from genetics. They echoed the emotional environment in which they were raised. Genetics loads the gun. The environment pulls the trigger. Gabor Maté. This striking metaphor captures the true interplay between biology and life experience. While our genes may create predispositions, they don't dictate outcomes. Genes are merely potentials, waiting to be activated, or not, based on the quality of our early relationships. Modern neuroscience confirms this viewpoint. Brain development, stress regulation, and attention capacity are all profoundly shaped by emotional surroundings. Children raised in chaotic households or under the care of anxious or depressed caregivers tend to develop defensive neurological patterns, not because they were born broken, but because their brains adapted to survive. Thus, Maté urges us to let go of genetic determinism and embrace a more compassionate paradigm. We are formed by connection, by the presence or absence of emotional safety, by the bonds we build or fail to build. We are not prisoners of our bloodline. We are shaped by what touched us or what never did. The illness of a normal culture. We live in a world that praises performance, productivity, and the illusion of control. From an early age, we're taught that emotions are weakness, that crying is shameful, and that vulnerability is dangerous. We grow up believing that being normal means adapting to a system, even when that system makes us sick. Gabor Maté warns of a painful paradox. What is widely accepted as normal in Western culture is, in fact, deeply dysfunctional. A society where parents are forced to choose between providing for their families and being emotionally present, where children are taught to compete instead of connect, where emotional silence is expected, where rushed conversations replace true listening, where affection is measured out, where stress is ever present and dismissed as ordinary. To be normal today is to live in a society that makes people sick. Gabor Maté. The consequences are everywhere: soaring rates of depression, anxiety, ADHD, autoimmune conditions, addiction, and profound loneliness. And yet, instead of addressing the root, we keep treating the symptoms, medicating bodies, disciplining behaviors, while never questioning the system that produces the illness. Maté refers to this system as the myth of normal, the title of one of his most compelling works. In it, he argues that what we deem common is not the same as healthy. Just because something is statistically widespread does not make it natural, let alone desirable. What is normal is not necessarily healthy. Gabor Maté. If most people are overwhelmed, anxious, emotionally distant, and physically unwell, perhaps the issue isn't in the individuals, but in the lifestyle we insist on calling civilization. We're conditioned to ignore our bodies, suppress our emotions, and silence our inner signals. And when the body screams, through illness, crisis, or emotional collapse, we reach for numbing solutions, not meaning. Maté proposed a radical shift in perspective. Instead of forcing people to adjust to a sick world, we must heal the world so that people can finally align with themselves. God, connection, and spirituality. Raised in communist Hungary, Gabor Maté identified as a committed atheist. To him, God was merely a cultural myth, an abstract idea with no place in a scientific, rational worldview. But as he immersed himself in the depths of human suffering and healing, something inside him began to shift. He began noticing a recurring element in the deepest recoveries he witnessed, a reconnection to something greater, not necessarily a religious conversion, but a profound sense of belonging, of meaning, of unity with the whole. This realization led him to reimagine the idea of God, not as a distant, all-powerful being, but as the very experience of connection, of full presence, of unconditional compassion. God to me is not a being, it is an experienced reality. Gabor Maté. Maté didn't become religious in the traditional sense, but he came to recognize the sacred in everything that reawakens a human being to their true nature. In this light, spirituality is not about doctrine, it is about healing. It is reunion. It is the dissolving of the wall between self and world. And often, real healing begins with the restoration of something that was taken from us, the feeling that we belong. The path to healing. If trauma is the disconnection from our true self, then healing must be the journey back. But this reconnection cannot be achieved through quick fixes, rushed diagnoses, or medications that merely mute symptoms. It requires presence, deep listening, and the courage to feel what has been buried for so long. Gabor Maté insists that healing is not about fixing what is broken. It's about recovering what was lost, the self. Many people spend their lives trying to become who they were before the trauma. But according to Maté, that is a misguided pursuit. The loss of self is the essence of trauma. Gabor Maté. True recovery is not a return to a former version of ourselves. It's the unveiling of who we are beneath the masks, beyond the defenses, past the coping mechanisms that once protected us, but now imprison us. Recovery isn't about becoming who you were, it's about discovering who you were meant to be. Gabor Maté. This rediscovery is neither instant nor linear, but it is possible, and when it happens, pain doesn't vanish, but it transforms. It stops being a burden and becomes a bridge to a life that is more real, more present, more whole. Pain is not a weakness, it's a signal, a call to turn inward, to listen to what was silenced, and to reclaim the parts of us that were left behind. Gabor Maté teaches that trauma can become a gateway, not to an end, but to a reconnection. Reconnection is possible, healing is real, and it begins when you stop judging yourself and start listening to yourself. Gabor Maté. If this message resonated with you, share it. Someone close to you may not need correction, but understanding, because healing is remembering who you are.